Hey everyone, welcome to this explainer. I want you to take just a quick second and picture the absolute best salesperson you can think of. What are their top 3 skills? If you're like most people, you're probably thinking about, expertly handling objections, asking those really clever open-ended questions, and, the big one, closing the deal. Well, what if I told you that in the high-stakes world of major sales, those exact skills might literally be destroying your chances of success? Today, we're putting on our research detective hats. We're going to dig into the wild story of how a massive million-dollar research study just totally dismantled conventional sales wisdom.
For decades, the undisputed gospel of the sales world has been summed up by that famous, kind of aggressive mantra, ABC, always be closing. I mean, generations of salespeople have been drilled to believe that if you aren't constantly pushing for a commitment, you're basically failing at your job. The traditional playbook was pretty straightforward, right? You open the call, ask a strategic mix of open and closed questions, bat away any objections the customer throws your way, and then deploy this massive arsenal of closing techniques to essentially trap them into saying yes. And honestly, on the surface, it sounds logical enough.
Okay, let's dive into this, because here is the exact number that completely shattered that entire playbook: 35,000. Over a staggering 12-year period, a research team at an organization called Huthwaite didn't just casually interview people. No, they physically sat in on and rigorously observed 35,000 actual sales calls across 27 different countries. And what they found? It was an absolute earthquake for the industry. It turns out all those traditional tactics, like agonizing over open versus closed questions or aggressively pushing for a close, they completely and utterly fail when it comes to major sales.
So, what does this all mean? Well, to understand why the old tricks fail, we really have to look at the psychological shift that happens when you move from small sales to major sales. Think about it for a second. Pushing super hard for a close, yeah, that might work perfectly for a quick, low-risk purchase. If a pushy salesperson corners you into buying, say, a cheap overhead projector, you might just say yes simply to get them out of your office. You never have to see them again. But try that exact same high-pressure tactic on a multi-call, $70,000 decision for enterprise accounting software. It totally tanks. In a major sale, the buyer is basically entering into a long-term relationship with you. The risk of them making a very public, very expensive mistake is massive. So, pressure tactics, they just backfire.
Let's actually define what we mean by closing. Basically, it's any behavior used by the seller that implies or forces the buyer into a position of commitment. Now, early on in this research, there was this vice president of sales in Chicago who was pretty worried because his team was missing their targets. So he asked the Huthwaite researchers to shadow his reps. He was totally convinced his superstar sellers were crushing it simply because they were aggressive closers, and he fully expected the data to prove him right. Well, he was in for the shock of his career.
And this brilliantly illustrates exactly what shocked him so much. When you compare the success of high close calls against low close calls, the difference is just night and day. In the calls where salespeople heavily relied on closing techniques, we're talking an average of almost 6 per call. Their success rate was a really dismal 38%. But in the calls where sellers used barely any closing techniques at all, like just 1.4 on average, the success rate skyrocketed to 70%. The data proved his superstars weren't closing hard at all. Actually, scratch that, it was worse. The more a seller tried to close, the more likely they were to completely lose the deal.
Now, to prove this wasn't just some weird fluke, the researchers found the absolute perfect laboratory, a chain of photographic stores. This company was actively training its staff in these aggressive closing techniques. But here is the truly genius part of the study. They rotated their staff every single day. So one day, a salesperson would work the counter selling really cheap accessories. The very next day, that exact same person would work the counter selling highly expensive, top-tier cameras. This setup allowed the researchers to completely isolate the size of the decision while keeping the salesperson and their training exactly the same.
First up, they measured the impact of this closing training on those cheap goods. And honestly, surprisingly, the traditional training actually worked. Before the training, they were closing about 72% of their transactions. After they were trained to use more of these pushy closing behaviors, their transaction times got noticeably faster and their success rate bumped up to 76%. So, for small everyday decisions, forcing the customer's hand sped up the line and worked absolutely fine.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is what happened the very next day. Same exact salespeople, same exact closing techniques. But now they're selling the more expensive goods. And by the way, expensive in this context averaged just $109. But look at this bombshell data. Sure, the transaction time went down again, but the success rate absolutely plummeted. It went from 42% before the training all the way down to an abysmal 33% after the training. Think about that. Even at just a $100 price point, closing techniques were literally destroying sales.
I mean, if it fails that badly at $100, imagine how disastrous it is at $100,000. The reality is, professional buyers actively despise standard closing tricks. There's this fantastic anecdote from the study about a senior buyer for British Petroleum. This guy actually kept a little box of index cards right on his desk. Each card had a famous closing technique typed on it, like the assumptive close or the alternative close. If a salesperson came in and tried one of those techniques on him, he would literally pull out the specific card, lay it face up on the desk, and warn them they only had one strike left. If they tried a second trick, boom, he'd throw them right out of his office. No way!
And the damage doesn't even stop at a lost sale. Forcing a customer into a decision absolutely poisons the post-sale relationship. The researchers found that customers who bought from salespeople heavily trained in closing techniques reported significantly lower post-sale satisfaction compared to those who bought from sellers who weren't trained that way. Plus, they were far less likely to ever buy from that store again. So in major sales, where your ongoing relationship is essentially your most valuable asset, closing techniques are basically a self-inflicted wound.
So if closing isn't the magic answer, what on earth is? Let's shift gears here from the myth to the reality. The researchers discover that every single successful major sales call actually breaks down into 4 very distinct stages. First, you have the preliminaries. That's your basic warm-up. Second is investigating, where you're asking questions. Third is demonstrating capability, where you finally show off your solution. And fourth is obtaining commitment, which is where the actual decision gets made.
As you'll see, there's a very clear logical flow between these stages. But the tragic flaw of all that old-school sales training is that it obsesses entirely over that final arrow, obtaining commitment. But remember those 12 years of observational research? They unequivocally proved that the second arrow, the investigating stage, is the absolute crucible. This right here is where major sales are actually won or lost. If you fail during the investigation, there is literally no magic closing phrase at the end that's going to save you. So let's clearly define what true investigating actually means when the stakes are high. It is this crucial, deeply empathetic process of uncovering needs and truly understanding the customer. It's not just mechanically running down some checklist to gather basic data. It requires serious, high-level skill. In fact, the data showed that top performers were able to increase their overall sales volume by over 20% simply by fine-tuning their skills in this one single critical stage. That is a real game changer.
So the crucial point is, how exactly do you investigate effectively? Well, brace yourself for another massive mythbuster. For 60 years, salespeople were told that the ultimate secret was using open questions, the ones that require long answers, instead of closed questions that just get a quick yes or no. But when the Huthwaite team tracked this across thousands of calls, they found absolutely zero measurable relationship between the use of open or closed questions and actual sales success in major accounts. None. Some top performers used entirely closed questions, some used entirely open. It seriously just didn't matter.
What actually mattered wasn't the grammatical type of question, but the sequence and the purpose behind the questions. By carefully watching how the absolute best salespeople in the world navigated the investigating stage, the researchers uncovered a remarkably powerful framework. They called it the SPIN strategy, S-P-I-N. It stands for situation, problem, implication, and need payoff. This framework right here is the ultimate blueprint for how top performers build incredible, undeniable value in the minds of their buyers.
It all kicks off with situation and problem questions. Now, successful sellers do begin by asking background situation questions just to establish some basic context. Things like, how long have you had your present equipment? But they don't linger there too long, because frankly, buyers get bored. Instead, they quickly pivot over to problem questions. They'll ask things like, are you worried about the quality you're getting from that older machine? They actively explore the client's difficulties and dissatisfactions, essentially hunting for areas where their specific solution can step in and help.
Let's move to and see how this builds into what is arguably the secret weapon of the major sale, implication questions. See, average sellers find a problem and immediately jump in to pitch their solution. Top sellers, they don't do that. They ask implication questions that take that newly discovered problem and explore its devastating consequences. They'll ask, what effect does this reject rate actually have on your overall customer satisfaction? Or how exactly is this bottleneck impacting your bottom line? They guide the customer to realize that the problem isn't just a minor annoyance, it's a serious, urgent, and incredibly costly issue.
Once that problem is thoroughly magnified in the buyer's mind, the masters deploy the final step, need payoff questions.
Instead of the salesperson just listing off the benefits of their product, they ask questions that ingeniously prompt the customer to articulate those benefits themselves. They might ask, if we could speed up this operation by 10%, how exactly would that help you? And then the customer answers with all the amazing things your solution is going to do for them. It's brilliant. The data showed that top performers ask 10 times as many need-payoff questions as average performers. They literally get the customer to sell themselves.
All of this incredible, paradigm-shifting data was eventually compiled by Neil Rackham into his legendary book, Spin Selling. This million-dollar research project fundamentally changed how major corporations approach high-value, relationship-based selling. It proved with hard, undeniable data, not just anecdotes, that relying on cheap tricks, high pressure, and outdated questioning models doesn't just fail to win big deals, it actively chases them away.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, I really want to leave you with this final, provocative thought. When you look at your own professional interactions, are you blindly pushing for a close, or are you genuinely investigating for a need? It might finally be time to ditch the old ABCs of selling and start thinking about the real psychological mechanics of how people actually make big decisions. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive, and hey, keep investigating.